Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you carefully care for your flowers, water them, feed them with fertilizer, and in response they just keep growing leaves and stubbornly refuse to bloom? This is one of the most frustrating situations for any gardener, especially when you've been dreaming of enjoying beautiful flowers on your balcony, in your garden, or on your windowsill. Here's an interesting fact. In almost all cases, the lack of blooming is not a coincidence and not the plant's fault. It's a signal that something in your care doesn't match what your flower actually needs. And the good news is that most of these mistakes are easy to fix if you know exactly what to look for. Today, we'll break down exactly 4 mistakes that most often lead to the absence of blooms. But this isn't just a list. We'll talk about how each of these mistakes affects the plant, why it reacts this way, and most importantly, how to fix it. After this video, you'll know exactly where to look if your flowers suddenly decide to stop blooming, in the worst sense of the phrase. Let's start. First mistake. You've miscalculated the lighting. Light is the foundation of everything. Imagine that light for a plant is the same as oxygen is for a human. Without it, nothing will work properly, and flowers definitely won't appear. But here's what's interesting. Most people either give too little light or, on the contrary, think that the more light, the better. And both approaches are wrong. Let's start with insufficient light. This is a very common problem in apartments, especially if you don't have a south-facing window. A plant that doesn't get enough light starts spending all its energy trying to grow more leaves. It's essentially trying to catch as much light as possible for photosynthesis. As a result, you see a plant that's covered with healthy green foliage, but there are no flowers in sight. The plant simply doesn't have enough energy for blooming when all its resources are going into growing stems and leaves. Which flowers are particularly demanding when it comes to light? Roses, pelargoniums, petunias, carnations. They're all sun-loving cultures that need a minimum of 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight per day. If you're growing them on a window that only gets sun for 2 or 3 hours a day, or on a north-facing windowsill, then the lack of blooms is almost guaranteed. But there are also plants that get by with diffuse light. African violets, orchids, begonias, they prefer bright but indirect light. If you put them in direct sunlight, especially in summer, the leaves can get sunburned and the plant will suffer. In this case, the lack of blooming is also quite logical. So how do you figure out if your specific flower is getting enough light? There's a simple way. If at noon you look at the plant and it casts a clear, sharp shadow, then it's getting direct sunlight. If the shadow is blurry or barely visible, then it's diffuse light. Remember these 2 options and look up the requirements for your specific flower in a reference or online. The second thing about lighting is the quality of light. In summer, the sun is bright and full spectrum, but what happens in the fall and winter? The days get shorter, the sun shines at a lower angle, and the amount of light your plants receive drops by 1/3 or even more. Many people don't account for this factor and then wonder why a plant that bloomed well in summer suddenly refuses to bloom in winter. How do you fix this? First, move the plant to the brightest spot in your home. If possible, choose a window on the southwest or southeast side. Second, in winter you can use grow lights. They don't have to be expensive. Even a regular LED bulb placed above the plant at a distance of 20 to 30 centimeters can give your plant several extra hours of light per day. The key is that it needs to be consistent. Turn the light on at the same time every day. But let's move on to the second mistake, because while we've been talking about light, the second problem is already lurking in many pots throughout homes and apartments. Second mistake: disrupted watering schedule. Water is the second most important thing after light. But here's the paradox. People often make mistakes not so much with too little water, but with too much. We call this overwatering, and it's probably number 1 cause of death for indoor plants. Imagine a plant's roots as a respiratory system. Yes, they absorb water and nutrients, but they also need air. When you overwater a plant, the soil becomes constantly wet, and the roots literally drown. They start to rot because in waterlogged conditions, fungi and bacteria actively develop and destroy root tissue. A plant can look fine for a week or 2. Leaves will be green, stems will be firm, but underground a disaster is happening. When roots die, the plant can no longer absorb water and nutrients, and as a result, it doesn't have the energy to bloom. How can you tell if you're overwatering? There are several signals. First, the soil in the pot is constantly wet. If you check the soil with a stick or your finger, and it's wet every time you check it, that's overwatering. Second, leaves become soft, often turn yellow and drop off. Third, there might be an unpleasant smell coming from the pot. That's the smell of rotting roots and mold in the soil. Now, how often do plants really need to be watered? The answer is, it depends. It depends on the type of plant, on the pot size, on the humidity level, on the temperature in your home, on the season. In summer, most plants grow actively and need more water. In winter, growth slows down and the need for water drops. Here's a universal rule. Water only when the top part of the soil has dried out. Check about 2 centimeters deep with your finger. If the soil feels dry to the touch, you can water. If it's still moist, wait another day or two. For plants in small pots, you might check every 2 to 3 days. For plants in large pots, it might be once a week or once every 2 weeks. Here's another practical tip. Choose a regular day for checking moisture. For example, every Tuesday and Friday you check which plants need watering, and you only water those whose soil is dry. This is much more effective than watering whenever you remember, or because it's been a while. The second thing about watering is water quality. If you have hard water, rich in minerals, especially calcium and magnesium, over time these minerals accumulate in the soil. This changes the acidity of the soil and prevents the plant from absorbing nutrients properly. As a result, even if you fertilize the plant, it can't fully use those fertilizers. And without proper nutrition, there will be no flowers. What should you do? If you have hard water, try to use settled or rainwater. You can leave water in an open container overnight. During that time, heavy minerals will settle to the bottom. You can also use a water filter. But the simplest thing is, when you see a white coating on the soil, these are mineral salts. Repot the plant in fresh soil and start using better water. And one more thing, water temperature matters. Cold water straight from the tap can shock the roots, especially if the temperature difference is large. Try to make sure the water is room temperature. Leave water for watering in an open container for a day or two before using it. It will warm up to the right temperature, and chlorine will evaporate if it's tap water. So, to summarize on watering, check soil moisture before watering, water only when the top part of the soil has dried out, use quality water at approximately room temperature, and remember that it's better to underwater than to overwater. Now let's move on to the third mistake, which is directly related to plant nutrition. Third mistake: wrong soil and lack of nutrients. Soil is not just something in which the plant grows. Soil is actually a bank of nutrients and a microbiome that helps the plant develop. And if the soil is wrong, even if you care for it perfectly in every other way, there still won't be any blooms. Let's start with what type of soil different plants need. There are several main types of soil. Universal potting soil for indoor plants is what works for most species. It usually consists of peat, perlite, vermiculite, and a bit of bark. But there are plants that need special soil. Orchids, for example, don't grow in regular soil. They need a substrate that consists mainly of bark and provides good aeration. If you plant an orchid in regular potting soil, its roots will start to rot because the soil holds too much moisture and doesn't allow air to circulate. Succulents and cacti, on the other hand, need light, fast-draining soil with sand and perlite because they have low tolerance for excess moisture. The second important thing is nutrients. When you first plant a plant in fresh soil from the store, it has enough nutrients. But over time, roughly within 3 to 4 months of active growth, the plant exhausts most of these nutrients. If you don't add fertilizer, the plant starts to starve. And a starving plant won't bloom. Why? Because blooming requires a lot of energy and nutrients. It's like if a person wasn't eating enough, in that state they wouldn't run a marathon. Which nutrients are especially important for blooming? The main 3 are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is responsible for the growth of foliage and stems. Phosphorus is responsible for root development and blooming. Potassium is responsible for the plant's overall health. If you notice that your plant has few flowers, choose a fertilizer with higher phosphorus content. Usually the package shows 3 numbers, for example, 5-10-5. This means the fertilizer contains 5% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 5% potassium. For flowering plants, look for a fertilizer where the second number is higher. When should you start fertilizing? Generally, the active growth period is spring and summer. Starting in March or April, most plants begin to grow actively, and during this time they especially need nutrients. Fertilize once every 2 weeks with half the recommended dose, or once a month with the full dose. Both methods work well. In autumn, when growth slows down, reduce fertilizing or stop altogether. In winter, most plants don't need fertilizer unless you're growing something that blooms in winter, like a Christmas cactus or poinsettia. There's another nuance with soil and nutrition. The acidity level of soil, or pH, affects whether the plant can absorb nutrients. For example, if the soil is too acidic or too alkaline, the plant might not absorb necessary micronutrients like iron, manganese, zinc, even if they're present in the soil. This is called deficiency with abundance. The nutrients are there, but the plant can't use them. Most flowering plants prefer soil that's slightly acidic or neutral, with a pH around 6 to 7. If you buy soil from a store, it usually already has the right pH. But if you make your own soil, or if the soil in your garden isn't quite right, you can adjust the pH. If the soil is too acidic, add lime. If it's too alkaline, add peat or sulfur. But for most home gardeners, it's easier to just buy good soil from the store and not worry about adjusting it. Now that we've dealt with soil, nutrition, and light, let's move on to the fourth and final mistake. Something that many people don't account for at all. Fourth mistake. You're not giving your plant the right rest period, or you've got the temperature conditions wrong. This might sound strange, but plants need rest. Not all plants and not all the time, but many flowering plants are seasonal plants. They evolved in conditions where there are clear seasons. Spring, when everything wakes up. Summer, when everything blooms and grows actively. Autumn, when the plant prepares for winter. And winter, when it rests. In our homes, especially in winter when we have heating, the temperature is constant. The plant doesn't get the signal that autumn has come and it's time to prepare for rest. As a result, it can't properly form flower buds. Flower buds are special buds from which flowers will grow. If a plant doesn't get a period of cooling and shortened daylight, these buds won't form, and in spring, when it's time to bloom, there will be no flowers. Which plants especially need a rest period? Many types: azaleas, calceolarias, cyclamens, citrus plants, fuchsias, geraniums. They all require a rest period. During rest, they should be in a cooler temperature, around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, and receive less light. The rest period usually lasts several weeks, from late autumn to early winter. How do you recognize if your plant needs a rest period? There are several signs. If the plant grows in a temperate climate in nature, where there is a winter, then it probably needs a rest period. If it's a tropical plant that grows in nature near the equator, where temperature is constant all year, then it might not need a rest period. The most reliable way is to look up information about your specific plant. But let's look at a concrete example. Azaleas are some of the most beautiful flowering plants you can grow indoors. But they're unfortunately notorious because many people buy an azalea in bloom, bring it home, and a few weeks later the flowers drop, and the plant never blooms again. Why does this happen? Because the azalea was grown in a nursery at temperatures around 15 to 16 degrees Celsius and with shortened daylight. This forced the plant to form flower buds and bloom. When you brought it home, where the temperature is 21 to 23 degrees Celsius, as it usually is in apartments, the plant thought, "Oh, winter is over, it's time to grow leaves, not flowers." The flowers dropped, the plant started to grow. To make your azalea bloom again next year, every autumn you need to put it in a cooler place with a temperature of 12 to 15 degrees Celsius and shortened daylight for 2 to 3 weeks. This sounds complicated, but actually it's just placing the pot in a cool room or close to a window where it's cooler. The second thing related to temperature is temperature fluctuations. Plants, especially those that are used to a stable home climate, can be sensitive to sudden changes. If you place a plant on a windowsill where the air is cold at night from the window and gets heated by the sun during the day, this can cause stress. A stressed plant won't bloom. So, if you have flowering plants that are supposed to bloom seasonally, try to give them a cool winter rest, or at least don't move them to a warmer place in winter. If it's very warm in your home in winter and you don't have the ability to create a cool place, this might be the reason for the lack of blooms. There's one more thing that's often forgotten: air humidity. Many plants, especially tropical ones, prefer humid air. Hot, dry air during the winter heating season can prevent buds from forming or cause them to drop. If you've noticed that a plant drops buds right before blooming, this might be a sign of air that's too dry. To increase humidity, you can place the pot on a saucer with moist pebbles or moss, or mist the area around the plant several times a day. Misting the plant itself works, but remember that some plants with fuzzy leaves, like African violets, don't like being misted because it can cause spots on the leaves. So we've covered all 4 mistakes. Let's quickly go through them again because there was a lot of information, and it's good to have a brief checklist. Final checklist: what to check right now. First, light. Is your plant getting enough light? If it's a sun-loving plant, it needs direct light for a minimum of 4 hours a day. If it's a shade-tolerant plant, it needs bright but indirect light. In winter, this might not be enough, so consider using a grow light. Second, watering. Check if you're overwatering your plant. The soil should dry out between waterings. Make sure the pot has drainage holes so excess water can drain away. Use room temperature water, preferably settled or filtered. Third, nutrition. If a plant has been in the pot for more than 3 months, it probably needs fertilizer. Choose a fertilizer for flowering plants with higher phosphorus content. Fertilize regularly during the growing season, that is, in spring and summer. Fourth, rest period and temperature. If your plant is seasonal, give it a cool period in winter. At minimum, keep it at a temperature that doesn't exceed 18 to 20 degrees Celsius in winter. Avoid sudden temperature fluctuations. And there's a bonus tip that's not part of the main 4, but it's very important. Give your plant time. Some plants, especially if they're young, need an acclimatization period before they start blooming. If you recently bought a plant or repotted it, give it a month or 2 to adapt before you expect flowers. Now you know what to look for. Go through each point mentally and consider each plant that's not blooming. Chances are you'll find the reason. It might be a combination of several factors. It might be just one mistake that's easy to fix. Remember this: if a plant isn't blooming, it's not because it's like that. It's just because it's trying to tell you that something doesn't match its needs. And once you figure out what that is and fix it, the plant will gratefully thank you with beautiful flowers. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or if you have your own stories about how you managed to make a plant bloom that didn't want to, write in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more helpful tips on growing beautiful flowers.